This video is not meant to explain Abraham Lincoln as a hero. It is a story about a man who faced decisions without knowing for sure what the best choice was. Even in the middle of a war that had already begun, he struggled, hesitated, and questioned himself. Yet he continued to think carefully about what his decisions would mean beyond the present moment. This is a story about that time of uncertainty. So let's begin not with the war itself, but with the moment before anything was decided.
It was late enough that the city had begun to forget itself. Most windows in Washington were dark. The streets had quieted into something between rest and vigilance. The kind of silence that settles only when people believe, for a few hours at least, that nothing urgent will be asked of them. Inside the White House, that belief did not exist. A single room remained awake. A desk stood beneath a low burning lamp. Papers lay arranged with care, not in haste, but not in comfort either. And seated there was Abraham Lincoln, still, reading a document he already knew by heart. In 72 hours, this letter would be read aloud. If he allowed it, once spoken, it would not belong to him anymore. Once released, it would move faster than intention, faster than regret. It would pass from room to room, city to city, life to life, unchanged by explanation. Lincoln understood this. That was why he had not signed it. This is not a story about freedom. Not yet. It is a story about how long a man can carry responsibility alone. Outside this room, a nation was already at war. Men were dying daily, often without knowing what their deaths were meant to achieve. Families were learning to live with absence as routine. And still, this paper remained unsigned. The document itself was not dramatic. It did not promise miracles or reconciliation. It was written in careful language, measured, restrained, almost narrow, but Lincoln knew what it would unleash. He leaned back slightly, eyes closing for just a moment. He had learned early in life that important moments rarely feel important when they arrive. They do not announce themselves. They simply wait until delay becomes impossible. Silence had always been his way of listening. He trusted it more than voices, more than crowds, more than certainty. Silence allowed complexity to surface. It slowed the world long enough for consequence to be seen. But tonight, silence felt heavier. It was no longer empty. It was full of lives, of futures, of things that could not be undone. If he signed the letter, the war would change its nature. It would grow sharper, more dangerous, more personal. The nation would no longer pretend it was fighting only to restore what had been broken. It would be forced to confront what it had allowed to exist. If he did not sign, the war would continue exactly as it was, bloody, directionless, exhausting, and slavery would remain untouched by law, even as the war reshaped it in reality. There was no version of tomorrow that felt safe. Lincoln opened his eyes and looked again at the paper. He had written these words months earlier, not in a moment of courage, but in a moment of clarity that had come and gone too quickly. Since then, he had revised them, adjusted them, tested them against time. Each revision had not made the decision easier. It had made it heavier, because the longer he waited, the more responsibility accumulated. He had not delayed because he did not care. He had delayed because he cared too much. He knew that once this letter was released, there would be no quiet way back, no gentle correction, no shared ownership of the outcome. This decision would not be distributed. It would be his. In public, people believed they understood him. They saw the speeches, the stories, the measured humor. They believed he was decisive. What they did not see were the nights like this, when decision did not feel like strength, but like exposure. Lincoln had never feared being wrong. What he feared was being early enough that the nation would tear itself apart before it understood what it was being asked to become. He had spent years learning how to wait. Waiting had kept him alive. It had kept him from rushing into failures he could not repair. It allowed him to survive loss, poverty, obscurity. Waiting had always felt like wisdom. But here, now, waiting felt different. It felt visible. It felt like something the war itself was beginning to notice. The reports had grown more urgent, the questions more pointed. Not just what are we doing, but why are we still doing it this way? Lincoln knew that people were beginning to sense what he had sensed for some time, that endurance without direction becomes its own kind of cruelty. He stood and walked toward the window. The city below slept. Somewhere far from here, men lay on cold ground, waiting for orders that would arrive without explanation. Somewhere else, enslaved people waited too, not knowing whether the law would ever recognize what the war had already begun to change. This was the quiet cruelty of leadership, to see what others could not yet see, and to be unable to explain it without causing harm. Lincoln returned to the desk. Beside the proclamation lay another sheet of paper. This one bore no seal, no formal heading. It was a letter, not meant for Congress, not meant for the public, perhaps not meant to be sent at all. A place where a man could try to explain himself without needing to persuade. He read the opening line, then stopped. He knew that if he finished writing it, he might never send it, and if he never sent it, it would not matter. But writing it mattered to him, because it acknowledged something he had not yet said aloud. But the hardest part was no longer the decision itself. The hardest part was admitting that he had already made it. The clock continued its quiet movement. 72 hours. Not long enough to change the stakes. Too long to pretend they were not there. Lincoln understood now that the question was no longer whether the nation was ready. Readiness is a luxury history rarely grants. The question was whether he could continue carrying the weight alone, because responsibility carried too long without action does not remain neutral. It bends, it distorts, and eventually it breaks. He sat down once more. The pen rested where it had rested before. Lincoln did not reach for it yet. He allowed himself one honest thought, not as a president, not as a symbol, but as a man who had spent his life learning how to endure. Waiting had protected him, but waiting could not protect everyone else. And for the first time that night, he understood with clarity that surprised him. This story was no longer about patience. It was about release. The clock moved forward. 72 hours. Lincoln took a breath and waited, not because he believed time would save him, but because he knew this was the last moment when waiting was still possible. Long before the nation placed its weight on his shoulders, Abraham Lincoln had already learned what it meant to carry things alone. He did not grow up surrounded by voices. He grew up surrounded by absence, a small cabin, few books, long stretches of time where nothing arrived to explain itself. The world he entered did not offer guidance. It offered endurance. When his mother died, there was no language for grief, no ritual to soften it. Loss simply appeared and stayed. No one told him how to make sense of it. They told him instead to continue, and so he did. This was not resilience as people like to imagine it. It was not courage or optimism. It was something quieter. It was the ability to live without answers. From an early age, Lincoln learned that acting too quickly often made things worse. That speaking before understanding invited consequences that could not be undone. So he learned to pause, to observe, to wait. Waiting was not something he admired. It was something he practiced. He waited through hunger and cold, through work that exhausted the body and left the mind alone with itself. He learned to read slowly because books were scarce and time was not. Each page mattered. This way of living shaped how he thought. He did not rush toward certainty. He let questions sit, and while others saw hesitation, Lincoln was learning something far more difficult: how to hold uncertainty without collapsing under it. As a young man, he failed more often than he succeeded. Businesses collapsed. Relationships strained. Elections were lost. Each failure did not harden him. It deepened him. He did not respond with defiance or anger. He responded by staying present, by refusing to let disappointment dictate his next move. This was not passivity, it was restraint. Lincoln began to understand that some outcomes could only be avoided by not acting too soon, that there were mistakes you could recover from and mistakes that stayed with you forever. Waiting became a way of protecting the future from the present. Those around him often misunderstood this. They wanted declarations. They wanted clarity. They wanted him to speak before the moment had fully revealed itself. But Lincoln resisted that pressure, not because he lacked conviction, but because he respected consequence. He understood that words once spoken publicly do not disappear. They become commitments, whether you intended them to or not. So he chose them carefully. In conversation, he listened more than he spoke. He allowed silence to do its work. He noticed that people often filled quiet spaces with their true thoughts. That urgency revealed more than intention. This habit followed him into politics. While others competed to sound certain, Lincoln sounded thoughtful. While others rushed to define themselves, he waited for definition to emerge. Some called this weakness. Others sensed something else, that he was difficult to rush, difficult to corner, that he carried a different relationship to time. Lincoln did not believe that every problem demanded immediate resolution. He believed that many problems demanded patience first. This belief served him well until the scale of responsibility began to change. As his public life expanded, so did the weight he carried. Decisions no longer affected only him. They affected communities, states, eventually a nation. And still his instinct remained the same. Hold first, move second. He had learned that acting without understanding could destroy more than it fixed. He had learned that endurance, though invisible, was often what kept structures standing long enough to be repaired. This instinct made him different from those around him. It made him frustrating. It also made him trustworthy to those who understood what he was doing. Lincoln was not trying to avoid responsibility. He was trying to avoid careless responsibility. He knew that some choices once made could not be reversed by apology or explanation. He had lived long enough to see that damage, so he waited. He waited not because he was afraid of being wrong. He waited because he was afraid of being early enough to break something fragile, early enough to turn uncertainty into chaos. This way of being shaped his entire inner life. He became comfortable with discomfort, familiar with doubt. He did not seek relief from it, he carried it, and in doing so, he developed a capacity most people never cultivate: the ability to remain steady while unresolved questions pressed in from every side. This was not indecision. It was containment. Containment of fear. Containment of anger. Containment of the urge to simplify. As Lincoln matured, this containment became visible in his posture, his speech, his presence. He did not move like a man eager to dominate a room. He moved like a man careful not to collapse it. This is what many missed about him. They saw the pauses and assumed emptiness. They did not see the weight being held during those pauses. By the time the nation began to fracture, Lincoln had spent a lifetime preparing, not to act decisively, but to endure decisively, to stay present when others fled into certainty, to resist the comfort of easy answers. This is why, when the crisis came, he did not rush toward resolution. He understood something most people do not want to accept, that not all responsibility announces when it is ready. That sometimes the hardest part is not choosing, but holding the choice long enough to understand what it will demand. Lincoln had practiced this his entire life, but nothing in his past had prepared him for the scale of what was coming. Waiting had been a skill, a shield, a way to survive loss without becoming bitter. But now the same instinct would be tested against something far larger than personal failure or disappointment. It would be tested against history. For now, though, Lincoln still believed that patience could protect what mattered, that if he held the weight carefully enough, the right moment would reveal itself. He did not yet know that some moments do not reveal themselves. They arrive only when waiting has reached its limit. And when that happens, the very skill that once kept everything from falling apart must transform into something else, action. But that lesson was still ahead. For now, Abraham Lincoln remained what life had trained him to be, a man capable of holding uncertainty longer than most, a man who believed that restraint was not weakness, a man who did not yet know that the weight he carried was about to demand release. When Abraham Lincoln stepped into the presidency, the country was not waiting for leadership. It was already moving. States had left before he arrived. Others were preparing to follow. Oaths were abandoned quietly, without speeches or ceremony. The nation did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, unevenly, until movement itself became unstoppable. Lincoln inherited that motion. He did not cause it. But from the moment he took office, he became responsible for where it would lead. In public memory, wars begin with gunfire. In reality, this one began with patience running out. For decades, compromise had postponed collapse. Agreements were signed, praised, and resented in equal measure. Each one bought time. None resolved anything. Slavery sat at the center of that tension, not only as a moral failure, but as a structural force. It shaped labor. It shaped wealth. It shaped who held power and who did not. And more importantly, it shaped fear. The South feared loss of control of identity, of a way of life that had grown inseparable from domination. The North feared expansion, the spread of slavery into new territories, new futures. Neither side trusted the other to stop. By the time Lincoln arrived, trust was already gone. He understood this. That was why his early words were careful. He spoke of continuity, of law, of preservation. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. To some, this sounded reasonable. To others, it sounded like surrender. And to many, it sounded irrelevant. The country was no longer waiting to be reassured. It was waiting to be directed. But direction came at a cost. Move too quickly, and the remaining border states might break away. Move too slowly, and the war would continue without meaning. Every option narrowed the others. Time, which had once been Lincoln's ally, now behaved differently. It did not slow things down. It accelerated them. The first shots were fired. Then came the lists. Names printed in small type. Battles reduced to unfamiliar places. Families learning for the first time how official language announces loss. Lincoln read these reports carefully. He did not skim them. He did not distance himself from them. He believed that if he was going to carry responsibility, he had to feel its weight. Letters arrived from generals demanding resources, from governors demanding clarity, from citizens demanding purpose. Each letter assumed the same thing, that someone somewhere was still in control. Lincoln knew better. The war was advancing faster than explanation. Men were dying for a union that had not yet explained itself. That uncertainty disturbed him more than defeat, because wars without meaning do not simply end, they decay. He watched as generals failed, not always from lack of courage, but from lack of direction. Victories were partial. Defeats were costly. Every delay increased pressure, not only on the battlefield, but in the capital. The press grew louder. Politicians grew impatient. They wanted decisiveness. But decisiveness without alignment was just speed. Lincoln had spent his life resisting that kind of movement. He had learned that rushing often created damage that endurance could not repair. But this was no longer a personal dilemma. The scale had changed. This was a nation unraveling in real time. The longer the war continued without purpose, the more dangerous it became. Soldiers needed to believe they were fighting for something that extended beyond the next order. Civilians needed to believe that sacrifice pointed somewhere. Endurance alone could not sustain that belief. Lincoln felt this pressure closing in, not as panic, as gravity. The war was pulling everything toward its center, and at that center was a question no one wanted to answer yet. What exactly was this war for? The Union as an idea was a structure, a framework of laws and borders. But structures do not inspire people to die. Meaning does. Lincoln understood that without meaning, the war would hollow itself out. He began to sense that waiting his lifelong discipline was losing its protective quality. Waiting was no longer buying clarity. It was allowing momentum to define outcomes. And momentum has no conscience. Each night as Lincoln returned to his desk, the same realization followed him. He was no longer simply choosing when to act. He was choosing whether to let events decide in his place. The war had not asked his permission to begin, but it would not end without his involvement. This was the moment when the world he had learned to endure began to outrun him. The habits that had once kept him steady now felt strained against the pace of collapse. Lincoln was still waiting. But the country already on fire was no longer willing to wait with him. The war did not arrive in a single overwhelming moment for Abraham Lincoln. It arrived in increments, in reports that came at regular intervals, in numbers that grew familiar too quickly, in victories that did not feel like relief, and defeats that felt indistinguishable from progress. At first, each battle carried its own gravity. Each loss demanded attention. Each decision felt singular. But as the months passed, something changed. Not in the scale of the war, but in how the mind responded to it. Lincoln noticed this before anyone else. He noticed it in himself. He read the casualty lists as he always had, slowly, deliberately. Killed, wounded, missing. At first, every word landed with weight. Later, the weight remained, but the shock did not. This disturbed him more than panic ever could, because panic passes. Adaptation stays. He understood that the human mind, when faced with sustained loss, does something dangerous. It learns how to continue, not because the loss has become acceptable, but because stopping feels impossible. Lincoln feared this quiet adjustment. He feared the moment when endurance stopped being conscious and became automatic. Because once suffering becomes routine, it also becomes invisible. The war was not becoming less violent. It was becoming familiar. He refused to let that familiarity take root. When possible, Lincoln left the White House and visited the hospitals, not as a symbol, not as a comforter, but as a witness. Rows of men lay still beneath thin blankets. Some stared upward, eyes unfocused. Some whispered names that would not be recorded anywhere else. They did not ask him about strategy. They did not ask him about victory. They asked him when it would end. Lincoln listened. And he carried those voices back with him to his desk, to the silence, to the waiting that had once felt like wisdom. Now waiting felt crowded, not with uncertainty, with responsibility. Every advance on the battlefield demanded more men. Every success expanded the front. Victory did not reduce the cost. It multiplied it. Lincoln began to sense that the war had become self-sustaining. As long as it moved forward without definition, it would continue to consume lives simply to justify its own existence. This was not failure of courage. It was failure of meaning. The generals came and went. Some were confident. Some were cautious. Many were wrong. Lincoln learned quickly that confidence did not correlate with understanding. That certainty, when misplaced, produced casualties faster than doubt ever could. Each failed decision on the battlefield echoed far beyond the field itself. It arrived in letters written in careful language, in homes that would never return to what they had been. Lincoln read those letters too. Not all of them, there were too many, but enough to understand that delay was no longer neutral. Delay had shape. It had consequence. The war had begun as a question of preservation. It was becoming a test of endurance without explanation. And endurance, when it is not guided by purpose, becomes exhaustion. Lincoln felt this exhaustion everywhere. In the press, where patience gave way to accusation. In Congress, where unity fractured into suspicion. In conversations that once explored options and now demanded answers. People no longer asked, "What should we do?" They asked, "Why are we still doing this?" This shift mattered because it meant the war was no longer being measured by progress alone. It was being measured by justification. Lincoln understood that wars are not sustained by force alone. They are sustained by belief. Belief that sacrifice leads somewhere. Belief that loss is not arbitrary. And belief was eroding, not dramatically, quietly. Lincoln sensed that his lifelong discipline, waiting, was approaching a limit. Waiting had always protected him from premature action. It had allowed time to reveal complexity. But now, waiting was allowing complexity to harden into contradiction. Men were dying for a union that refused to define itself. That contradiction could not survive indefinitely. Lincoln did not experience this realization as a burst of conviction. It arrived as discomfort that would not resolve, a tightening, a sense that something essential was being postponed too long. He found himself returning to the same thought in the quiet hours. At what point does not choosing become choosing? At what point does endurance stop being strength? He did not answer these questions aloud, but they followed him. They appeared in the pauses between conversations, in the moments after reading reports, in the growing awareness that the war was moving faster than explanation could keep up. Lincoln was still holding the weight, but the weight was no longer static. It was pressing forward, and the longer he held without releasing direction, the more it threatened to collapse inward. The war was no longer asking for patience. It was demanding articulation. It was demanding that someone name what the cost was for. Lincoln understood now that restraint, when prolonged beyond its purpose, becomes avoidance, not because the intention changes, but because the context does. He had not become less careful. The world had become less forgiving. Every victory cost 1,000 lives, not because the victories were wrong, but because they arrived without a meaning strong enough to carry them forward. Meaning delayed becomes urgency, and urgency, once it arrives, does not ask politely. Lincoln could feel it approaching. The war had stripped neutrality of its innocence. It had made silence visible, and soon silence would no longer be an option. There was a word that kept returning, no matter how carefully people tried to avoid it. It did not appear on official agendas. It rarely opened a speech. It was postponed with polite phrases later after the war. When things are stable, and yet it hovered in every room like smoke that would not clear. Slavery. For years, the country had treated it as something that could be managed by distance, something that could be argued in theory while lives were lived in practice. People spoke of it as if it belonged to a different time, a different region, a different problem. But the war did not allow distance. The war brought everything closer. It brought questions into camps, into cities, into the capital itself, until even the most careful language could no longer keep the word out. When Lincoln first took office, he hoped that he could keep the conflict narrow, preserve the Union, restore the structure, end the rebellion. He did not speak as if the war were meant to remake the country. He spoke as if it were meant to save it. This was not moral blindness. It was survival math. He understood how fragile the North truly was. He understood the border states loyal today, uncertain tomorrow. He understood that a war fought on moral absolutes might shatter the coalition before it ever reached victory. So he waited. He spoke carefully. He reassured. He avoided language that would ignite panic. For a while, this worked. The Union held barely. The political center did not collapse, but the war refused to remain narrow. Reality kept dragging the question back into view, because as the armies moved, people moved. Enslaved men and women began to appear at Union lines, not as symbols, not as arguments, but as exhausted human beings carrying nothing but urgency. They arrived after nights of hiding, after days of walking, after risks that could not be explained to anyone who had never been hunted for existing. They did not carry a political program. They carried a simple truth. They were already leaving slavery behind, whether the law acknowledged it or not. The army did not know what to do with them. At first, they were labeled contraband, a word that tried to turn human beings into property again, even in the moment they had escaped property. They were fed, sheltered, employed, sometimes protected, sometimes exploited, often left in uncertainty. Their presence unsettled everything. Because each person who arrived carried the same question without speaking it. If the Union is fighting for itself, what does that mean for me? Lincoln read the reports. He saw how officials twisted language to avoid stating the obvious. He saw the reluctance in every careful phrase, and he understood why people avoided the word, because naming slavery meant accepting what came next. It meant admitting that the war could not be fought without changing the country. It meant admitting that sacrifice demanded more than restoration, and that admission would break something. Or so they feared. Lincoln held that fear too. He understood, more than most, the cost of sudden clarity. He had spent his life respecting consequence. He knew that saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could turn allies into opponents overnight. He knew that a proclamation, no matter how justified, could feel to many like the beginning of chaos. And in war, people cling to structure even when structure is built on injustice. That is the difficult truth of stability. Sometimes it protects what should be replaced. Sometimes it becomes a shelter for wrongdoing. Lincoln did not want to destroy stability unless he could replace it with something stronger. But the war was already replacing it with something worse: uncertainty without direction. The longer the conflict continued without naming slavery, the more the nation began to rot from within. The contradiction grew sharper. Men were dying to preserve a union that had allowed slavery to define it. They were bleeding for a structure that refused to explain what it stood for. And once people notice contradiction, they cannot unnotice it. Lincoln felt that shift as moral pressure, not loud, not theatrical, but relentless. It followed him into quiet rooms. It sat beside him while he read reports. It appeared in the simplest questions from soldiers and citizens alike. What are we doing this for? He knew what many wanted him to say. They wanted him to declare the war a moral crusade, to speak of freedom as an absolute and victory as destiny. But Lincoln distrusted speeches that made hard things sound easy. He knew that if he declared too much too soon, he could lose the war entirely. And if he lost the war, every word would become meaningless. Freedom promised without power to enforce it is not freedom. It is exposure. So he kept reading, kept weighing, kept holding the weight longer than most people could tolerate. But weight, held too long, changes the body. It shifts posture. It compresses breath. Lincoln began to realize that avoiding slavery was no longer a way to protect unity. It was a way to protect discomfort. And discomfort, in this case, was not harmless. Because while the government avoided the word, the war made decisions anyway. Every time an enslaved person entered Union lines, the nation changed a little. Every time the army employed them, protected them, ignored them, argued about them, the nation made a statement without admitting it had spoken. The war was rewriting reality, while the law pretended nothing had happened. That gap between reality and law could not last. Sooner or later, it would tear something open. Lincoln understood the constitutional boundaries that constrained him. He understood that slavery in loyal states was not easily touched by executive decree. He understood that any broad action would be challenged, denounced, possibly reversed. That was part of the reason he hesitated. He was not trying to avoid morality. He was trying to ensure permanence, because temporary freedom that could be undone might be worse than none at all. It could invite hope and then punish it. Lincoln had seen how hope, when betrayed, turns into despair, and despair turns into violence. He also understood the world beyond America. Foreign governments watched this war like gamblers watching a table. They measured advantage. They weighed intervention. They followed public sentiment. A war framed only as a political dispute could be treated as politics. A war framed as a moral rupture could not. Lincoln knew that if the Union remained silent on slavery, others would decide what the war meant. Silence would be interpreted. It always is. And interpretation, once it spreads, becomes harder to control than any speech. So the pressure came from every side, from reality on the ground, from the minds of soldiers, from the moral exhaustion of citizens, from the calculations of foreign powers, and from Lincoln's own fear that endurance without naming the truth was becoming avoidance. This was the moment when the question changed shape. It was no longer, is slavery wrong? That question had already been answered in the human heart, even if not in law. The question became, how long can we keep pretending it is not the center? How long can we keep asking men to die while refusing to say what must change? How long can a nation survive while its deepest contradiction remains unnamed? Lincoln did not want to become a revolutionary. He wanted to become a bridge, something the nation could cross without collapsing. But to be a bridge, you have to stand in the space between what was and what must be. And that space is painful. It demands that you absorb pressure from both sides. Lincoln had absorbed pressure all his life, but now the pressure was national. The war was forcing the question into the open, not through speeches, through consequence. And Lincoln began to understand with a clarity he did not enjoy that his greatest risk was no longer action, it was delay. Because delay was no longer neutral. Delay was shaping outcomes. It was shaping the moral identity of the war itself. The longer he waited, the more the war became a struggle that could not justify its own cost. And the more the country began to drift toward a future that would be decided by exhaustion, not intention. Lincoln reached a quiet conclusion that did not feel like victory. It felt like surrender to reality. The question of slavery was no longer optional. It was the axis. The war was already turning on it. The only decision left was whether leadership would name what the war had already revealed. Whether Lincoln would put into words what the country had been living in silence. He had spent his life believing that patience could protect what mattered. Now he understood something harder. Sometimes patience protects the wrong thing. Sometimes it becomes a shelter for injustice. And when that happens, the most responsible act is not to wait longer, but to name the truth, even if naming it breaks the comfort of those who benefited from silence. Lincoln did not yet sign the paper, but he could feel his hand moving toward it. Because once a truth becomes unavoidable, the only question is how long you pretend it still isn't. And the war had ended pretending. The decision did not begin with the letter. By the time the words were written, something far more important had already happened. The decision had settled, not publicly, not officially, but internally, long before the nation demanded clarity. Lincoln had begun to understand what could no longer be avoided. The war had named its center. The question had refused to stay silent, and yet the letter remained on the desk, folded, revised, left untouched. It was not hesitation in the way people imagine hesitation. Lincoln was not unsure of what the words meant. He was unsure of what admitting them would require. The document itself was restrained, almost narrow in scope. It did not promise equality. It did not announce the end of suffering. It did not speak the language of moral triumph. It spoke instead the language of necessity. That choice was deliberate. Lincoln understood something many people prefer to forget. Words do not become powerful because they are inspiring. They become powerful because they change what can no longer be denied. This letter was not meant to comfort. It was meant to force alignment between reality and law. That alignment, once begun, could not be reversed without consequence. And that was what made the paper so heavy. Lincoln had written it carefully, aware of every limitation it contained. It freed some, not all. It applied in rebellion, not loyalty. It was temporary, conditional, and bound to the survival of the war itself. Critics would later call it insufficient. Lincoln already knew that. He had not written the letter to satisfy conscience. He had written it to survive consequence, because partial truth, once declared, has a strange power. It opens space, and space, once opened, demands to be filled. The letter on the desk was not the end of slavery. It was the moment when pretending slavery was not central became impossible. Lincoln returned to it night after night, not to revise the language, but to sit with what it represented. The paper did not accuse him. It waited. That waiting felt different from the waiting he had practiced all his life. This was not the waiting that protected fragile things. This was the waiting that delayed the inevitable. Lincoln could feel the distinction. He felt it in the tightening conversations with advisors, in the way questions were no longer hypothetical. People no longer asked, "Should we act?" They asked, "When? And how long can we afford not to?" The war continued without pause. Men died while the document remained unsigned. Events unfolded that assumed a future the law had not yet acknowledged. The world was moving ahead of the words. This was the moment when Lincoln understood something deeply unsettling. That delay, when the decision is already made, becomes a kind of dishonesty, not a moral failure, a practical one. Because pretending you have not chosen does not undo the choice. It only removes your ability to shape its consequences. Lincoln did not want to be shaped by the decision. He wanted to take responsibility for it. That responsibility felt heavier than fear. He knew what signing the letter would unleash. It would not calm the war. It would sharpen it. The conflict would no longer be framed as a fight over structure. It would become a fight over meaning. and meaning mobilizes people in unpredictable ways. Allies would fracture, opponents would radicalize, neutrality would disappear. Lincoln understood that once the letter was released, he would no longer control its interpretation. He would become the figure everything else reacted to. This was not power. It was exposure, and exposure frightened him more than opposition ever had. He thought often about timing. A proclamation issued after defeat would look desperate. Issued too early, it might collapse support before it could take root. Timing was not about finding the perfect moment. It was about avoiding the worst one. Lincoln waited for something he could live with, not approval, not safety. A moment where the letter would not be mistaken for panic. But the longer he waited, the less that moment existed. The war was answering for him. Enslaved people continued to reach Union lines. The Army continued to employ them. Foreign governments continued to watch. Reality was acting as if the proclamation already existed. The law simply lagged behind. Lincoln began to understand that the choice was no longer between action and restraint. It was between acknowledgement and denial. Acknowledgement meant risk. Denial meant surrendering authorship. And Lincoln had never believed that leadership meant avoiding risk. He believed it meant choosing which risks to accept. The letter on the desk represented that choice. It was the physical form of a truth he had already accepted internally, that the war could not end without redefining what it had been fought to preserve. The Union could not be restored unchanged. Something fundamental had to give. Lincoln knew that once he signed, there would be no return to ambiguity. He would be accused of overreach, of hypocrisy, of delay and of haste, often in the same breath. He accepted that. What he struggled with was something quieter. The knowledge that by signing, he would confirm what he had been trying not to confirm, that the waiting which had once protected the nation had reached its limit. Waiting had bought time. It had preserved alliances. It had allowed complexity to surface, but it had also allowed suffering to accumulate without direction. Lincoln had spent his life believing that patience was a virtue. Now he was learning that patience extended beyond its purpose becomes refusal. Not refusal of morality, refusal of responsibility. This was the realization that settled in him as he sat with the letter. He had already decided. The delay was no longer about finding clarity. It was about finding the courage to accept what clarity demanded. The document did not need further revision. It needed consent, consent to consequence, consent to isolation, consent to being misunderstood. Lincoln understood that once he signed, the story would no longer be about his intentions. It would be about what happened next. That loss of narrative control is the price of decisive action. He had avoided that price for as long as he responsibly could. Now, avoiding it felt like another kind of failure. The letter remained on the desk, not as a question, as a mirror. It reflected back to Lincoln something he could no longer deny, that the hardest part was not writing the words. The hardest part was admitting to himself that he was ready to let them go, because once released, they would no longer belong to him. They would belong to the war, to the people, to history. And history does not ask permission. Lincoln sat with that knowledge through the quiet hours. He did not reach for the pen yet, but he could feel the distance between his hand and the paper shrinking. The waiting was no longer protective. It was preparatory. The letter had done its work. It had forced the decision to finish forming. Now all that remained was the moment when holding became release. And that moment was closer than he allowed himself to say aloud. The night did not arrive with urgency. It arrived the way most nights do, quietly, without asking whether anyone was ready. The White House settled into its familiar stillness. Corridors emptied, doors closed, and once again, a single room remained awake. At the desk sat Abraham Lincoln, the letter placed before him, not pushed aside, not hidden beneath other papers, centered. This was no longer a night of consideration. It was a night of reckoning. The hours ahead were no longer theoretical. They had weight. In the past, Lincoln had trusted time to clarify difficult things. He had believed that if he waited long enough, the shape of the right decision would reveal itself. But tonight, nothing new was forming. No new argument waited in the dark. No revelation lingered just beyond reach. Everything that could be known was already known. What remained was not understanding. It was acceptance. Lincoln did not begin by reading the letter. He listened instead to the faint sounds of the building, to the distant city, to the quiet reminder that the world continued unaware of how close it stood to change. This was the loneliness of responsibility. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of knowing that no one else could carry this moment for you. The war had demanded many things of him over the years: endurance, restraint, silence. But this night demanded something different. It demanded ownership. Lincoln thought of the men who would wake before dawn and march again. Some of them would die without ever knowing that the meaning of their war had shifted. He thought of the enslaved people who would hear rumors before they heard law, who would take risks based on words that might not yet protect them. He thought of the allies who would feel betrayed, of the opponents who would feel justified. This decision would not distribute its cost evenly. It would concentrate it on him. The pen lay beside the paper. Lincoln picked it up. Then he stopped. He did not stop because he doubted the words. He stopped because he understood what signing would mean about him. Once signed, the letter would tell the world something simple and dangerous: that he was willing to be responsible for consequences he could not fully control. He searched for certainty. There was none. He searched for peace. There was none. Instead, he found something quieter: resolve. Not the resolve of confidence, the resolve of consent. Consent to misunderstanding. Consent to backlash. Consent to isolation. Lincoln had never believed that leadership meant being sure. He believed it meant being answerable. He had once said, half in irony, half in fear, that he hoped to have God on his side. But what mattered more to him in this moment was something less abstract. He needed to know that he could live with himself after this night. The letter was restrained, almost cold. It did not sing of justice. It did not speak of equality. It spoke of necessity. Many would later criticize it for this. Lincoln already knew why it had to be written that way. This was not the end of slavery. It was the end of pretending that slavery was not the war's center. The clock moved forward. Each passing minute removed another excuse. This was not a moment of courage. It was a moment of surrender to reality. Lincoln lowered the pen again. For a brief instant, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he was about to do. The war would become harder before it ended. The nation would fracture further before it healed. His own life would become more dangerous. He accepted all of that, because what he could no longer accept was delay. Delay had become its own decision, and it was one he could no longer justify. The pen touched the paper. There was no dramatic pause, no sense of ceremony, just a steady hand moving forward. The signature took seconds. The consequences would take generations. Nothing in the room changed. The lamp burned as before. The paper remained still. History rarely announces itself. Lincoln set the pen down carefully. He did not smile. He did not close his eyes. He sat, absorbing the knowledge that the waiting, the discipline that had shaped his entire life, had finally reached its limit. He understood now that patience is not infinite. That restraint, when stretched beyond its purpose, becomes harm. And that leadership sometimes means knowing when the skill that once saved you must be set aside. The decision did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. Lincoln stood and walked toward the window. The city slept. Somewhere beyond the darkness, men were already preparing for battles that would now be fought under a different meaning. Somewhere else, enslaved people slept too, unaware that their status had shifted in law, even if not yet in life. Freedom would not arrive all at once. It would arrive unevenly, dangerously, incompletely. Lincoln knew this. He had not signed believing he was ending suffering. He signed because suffering without meaning had become unbearable. The letter would soon be delivered, read aloud, published. It would no longer belong to him, but this moment, this night, was his alone. He allowed himself one final thought, not of legacy, not of history, but of the boy he had once been. The boy who learned early that the world does not explain itself, that loss arrives without warning, that waiting can protect you, and that sometimes waiting can destroy what it once preserved. The man who signed the Proclamation had been shaped by silence, but he had learned at last when silence had to end. Lincoln returned to the desk and extinguished the lamp. The room fell into darkness. Outside, the night remained unchanged, unaware that a line had been crossed, and that the war would never again be the same. The decision had been made, not with certainty, but with responsibility, and that was enough. The letter did not change the world all at once. It left the room quietly. It was folded, delivered, read aloud, and then it began to move, not like an order, not like a command, like something released. Lincoln understood this immediately. The moment the words left his control, they no longer belonged to intention. They belonged to interpretation, and interpretation is never neutral. The proclamation reached different places in different ways. In some towns it arrived as celebration, a promise long delayed, finally spoken. In others it arrived as anger, as proof that something familiar was being taken away. And in many places it arrived as confusion. What does this mean? Who does it apply to? What happens now? There were no answers that traveled with the words. The war did not pause to explain. It absorbed the declaration and moved forward. Almost immediately, the conflict changed its tone. What had once been framed as a struggle over unity now carried a moral charge that could not be ignored. The war had found a direction, but direction does not guarantee control. Lincoln felt this shift from a distance. He read reports that no longer spoke only of troop movements, but of reactions, of resistance hardening, of resolve sharpening. The proclamation did not shorten the war. It intensified it. Opposition grew louder. Some accused Lincoln of acting too late, others of acting too far. Critics demanded to know why freedom had limits. Supporters demanded to know why it had waited so long. Lincoln found himself at the center of arguments that contradicted each other completely. This was the price of naming the truth. Once named, it could be judged from every angle. The Union Army felt the change first. Enslaved people who had already fled now arrived in greater numbers. They came not because the law had changed their courage, but because the law had finally acknowledged what courage had already done. They asked questions no one could avoid anymore. Were they free? What did freedom require? Where could they go? The Army did not have a system for this. Freedom arrived without infrastructure. It arrived unevenly. Some were protected. Some were ignored. Some were exploited under new names. The proclamation had not solved these problems. It had exposed them. And exposure is often more disruptive than injustice that remains hidden. Black men began to enlist, not cautiously, deliberately. They knew the risk. Capture could mean execution. Defeat could mean return to bondage. Still, they stepped forward. Their presence transformed the war in ways no proclamation ever could. They fought not for an abstract union, but for families still enslaved, for futures not yet imaginable. Their courage unsettled old arguments. It made neutrality uncomfortable. It made delay visible. Abroad, the shift was noticed. Foreign governments adjusted their calculations. Public opinion changed its tone. A war once framed as a political dispute now carried moral weight. Recognition of the Confederacy became difficult to justify. Without firing a shot, the proclamation altered the international landscape. But at home, the cost grew heavier. Threats against Lincoln increased. Opposition hardened into hostility. He was no longer merely a wartime leader. He had become a symbol, and symbols attract violence. Lincoln understood this risk when he signed. What he could not fully control was how deeply the decision would isolate him. Some allies distanced themselves. Others urged him to soften his language, to reassure those unsettled by change. But reassurance was no longer possible. The war had crossed a line. The proclamation had removed the illusion that this conflict could end without transformation. Lincoln did not celebrate this. There was nothing to celebrate. The war now demanded more from everyone involved. More endurance, more sacrifice, more clarity. And clarity often reveals how unprepared people are. The reports Lincoln received grew more complex. Battles were no longer measured only by territory gained or lost, but by what the proclamation had set in motion. Retaliation became harsher, resistance more desperate. The war was no longer only about defeating armies. It was about defeating an idea that refused to let go. Lincoln saw this clearly. The letter had unleashed forces that would outlast him. That knowledge settled heavily. Leadership, he understood, is not about controlling outcomes. It is about choosing which outcomes you are willing to be responsible for. The proclamation had forced the war to confront its own meaning. Now the war would decide whether the meaning could survive. Lincoln no longer asked whether signing had been right. That question belonged to another time. The only question now was whether the nation would endure the consequences long enough to finish what had been named. The waiting that had once defined him had been replaced by something more exhausting, endurance without illusion. He could no longer hope that the war would resolve itself gently. He could only hope that the meaning he had given it would hold. As the months passed, the cost continued to rise. Victory no longer felt like an achievement. It felt like a requirement. Anything less would leave the promise unfinished, and the country exposed to a future built on half-truth. The letter had opened a door. It had not told anyone how to walk through it. That work would be slower, messier. More painful. Lincoln understood that this was the unavoidable aftermath of any real decision. Once made, a decision does not end struggle. It redefines it. The proclamation had changed the direction of history, but history, once redirected, does not move smoothly. It resists. It tests resolve. It asks whether the responsibility taken can be carried all the way through. Lincoln returned to his desk each night, aware that the hardest part of leadership often comes after the boldest moment. When the noise fades, when the symbol is set aside, and when the consequences begin to speak for themselves, the letter no longer belonged to him, but the responsibility did. And that responsibility would not release him until the war itself found an end. By the time the end of the war began to appear on the horizon, the nation had changed in ways it could not name yet. The Confederacy was weakening. The Union's victory was no longer a wish. It was becoming a probability. And yet, the closer that probability came, the more dangerous the moment felt. Not because the fighting would suddenly intensify, though it often did, but because people began to imagine what they would do after. After years of loss, anger does not simply evaporate. It looks for a place to land. Lincoln could feel that. He could hear it in conversations that were no longer about strategy, but about punishment. He could see it in headlines that began to shift from how do we win to how do we make them pay. The war was approaching its end, and something darker was gathering behind the idea of victory. This is what few people admit about suffering. It does not always make people kinder. Sometimes it makes them hungry for balance, for compensation. For the kind of justice that feels like repayment. Lincoln understood this instinct because he shared it. He had carried the war long enough to know what it cost. He had read the names. He had walked through hospitals. He had watched families collapse under letters that arrived too often. He had earned anger. So had everyone else. But Lincoln also understood what anger becomes when it is granted authority. Anger, once institutionalized, turns into policy. And policy, once formed in resentment, becomes another kind of war. Victory would not guarantee peace. It would only create an opening. What came through that opening would depend on what the nation chose to carry forward, its grief or its restraint. This is where Lincoln's story turns quiet again, because by this point, the decisive moment signing the Proclamation was behind him. Now came the harder work, guiding the nation through the temptation to become cruel. In early 1865, Lincoln prepared to speak again, not to announce triumph, but to frame what came next. His second inaugural address was short. It did not read like a victory speech. It sounded like a man trying to keep a room from tipping into vengeance. The day itself was unsettled. Rain had fallen. The ground was soft with mud. Clouds gathered and thinned. The sky could not decide whether to brighten. Lincoln stepped forward, looking older than the years he had lived. His face held the evidence of endurance. Not dramatic, not theatrical, simply worn down by responsibility. People gathered expecting a declaration, a release of emotion. They wanted a sentence that would let them exhale. They wanted permission to feel justified. They wanted a story that would make the suffering orderly. But Lincoln did not offer that. Instead, he offered something harder, humility. He spoke as if the war had not been a test only of the South, but of the entire nation. He did not arrange the conflict into neat categories of purity and corruption. He spoke of shared responsibility, not equal, not identical, but shared in the sense that the nation had tolerated slavery long enough for it to shape everything. He spoke of the war as consequence, not as destiny, and not as proof of superiority. This was not the language people reach for in victory. It was the language of a man who understood that moral clarity is not the same thing as moral innocence. Lincoln could have stood there and claimed authority. He could have spoken like a conqueror, like the final judge of the nation's meaning. Many would have applauded that. But Lincoln knew that a conquered people can be forced into silence without being healed, and an unhealed nation does not remain stable. It waits, it hardens, it returns. If the Union won the war and then governed through humiliation and resentment, the country would not be saved. It would simply be paused. Lincoln's words moved carefully, as if he were walking across a surface that could break under too much weight. He spoke of a future that would require something more difficult than victory. Repair. He spoke of binding wounds, not as metaphor, but as instruction. Wounds, if you ignore them, do not become strength. They become infection. He knew that freedom declared was not the same as freedom protected. That emancipation opened a door, but did not build a home. He knew that Reconstruction would demand more from the nation than war ever had. Patience, discipline, imagination, and above all, restraint. Then he offered the line that would outlive him, with malice toward none. It was not sentimental. It was strategic in the deepest sense, because malice felt satisfying in the moment. But it created futures that lasted longer than satisfaction, with charity for all, not because charity was easy, but because it prevented the nation from collapsing into the same cruelty it claimed to oppose, with firmness in the right, not because the right was simple, but because the work ahead would require steadiness more than emotion. This was Lincoln's greatest discipline. He was not asking the nation to forget what it had suffered. He was asking the nation not to let suffering become its identity. He was asking people to carry grief without turning it into punishment. That request was not popular with everyone. Some wanted revenge, some wanted spectacle, some wanted the South to feel what the North had felt. Lincoln understood that desire. He also understood its cost, because if the nation built peace on vengeance, it would teach itself that domination is the natural end of conflict. And domination, once normalized, does not remain limited to former enemies. It returns inward. It finds new targets. It becomes habit. Lincoln's address did not end the war, but it tried to shape the ending. It tried to steer the nation toward a future where victory did not become another form of violence. When he finished speaking, the applause came, but it carried a different texture than celebration. There was admiration, yes, but also a kind of uneasy stillness. Because he had not given people what they expected. He had not given them a simple story. He had given them a responsibility. The war was nearly won, but peace was not. Peace would require the nation to choose restraint repeatedly, long after the last battle. Lincoln knew that if he could leave the public with one enduring instruction, it was not how to fight. It was how to end fighting without becoming what you fought. He returned to the White House with that thought sitting quietly beside him, and in the private hours that followed, the same truth remained. The hardest part of the war was not the battles. It was the moral temptation that followed them. The temptation to make suffering feel balanced by making someone else suffer. Lincoln refused that temptation, not because he was above anger, but because he understood what anger, given power, would build. Victory was approaching. But healing was not automatic. Healing would be a discipline. And disciplines, as Lincoln had learned throughout his life, are practiced not when they are easy, but when they are necessary, with malice toward none. It was not an ending. It was a direction, a way of pointing the nation toward a future where freedom could survive without being poisoned by revenge. And as he stepped back into the quiet of the White House, the war still outside the windows, he carried a final awareness that was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Even if the fighting ended, the work would not. The work of binding wounds, of protecting freedom, of resisting the urge to punish. That work would last longer than any speech, longer than any presidency, and perhaps longer than he himself would be allowed to remain. The war did not end the way people expected. It ended quietly, not with a final speech, not with a completed sentence, but with an interruption on an evening meant for rest, for a pause after years of vigilance. Abraham Lincoln sat among others in a place built for forgetting. There was music, there was laughter, there was the ordinary relief of being somewhere that did not demand decisions. For the first time in a long while, the weight was not visible. And then, without warning, the weight lost its bearer. The sound was sharp, but not immediately understood. Confusion moved faster than meaning. People stood before they knew why. When clarity arrived, it did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived as disbelief. Lincoln did not speak again. There were no final instructions, no last adjustments to what came next, no chance to guide the fragile moment he had spent years preparing. The nation woke the next morning as if waking too soon from a dream. The war was nearly over. The victory was close enough to touch. And the man who had insisted on restraint at the edge of triumph was gone. Morning spread not as celebration, but as silence. People gathered without knowing what to say. Bells rang without rhythm. Flags lowered slowly, as if unsure how far they should fall. It was not only grief that settled over the country. It was unease, because Lincoln had not only been a leader, he had been a holder of weight that others were not yet ready to carry alone. He had stood between anger and authority, between victory and vengeance, between freedom declared and freedom protected. And now that space was empty. In the days that followed, people searched his words for guidance. They returned to his speeches, to his letters, to phrases that now sounded less like ideals and more like warnings, with malice toward none. The words no longer felt aspirational. They felt unfinished. Lincoln had understood something that only becomes obvious after loss, that the most dangerous moment is not when a conflict begins, but when it ends and asks, what kind of people remain? The war would soon conclude. The armies would disband. The guns would quiet, but the deeper questions would not. What does freedom require after it is declared? What does unity demand after it is broken? What does restraint look like when anger feels justified? Lincoln had not answered these questions. He had only insisted they be faced. In life he had carried responsibility quietly. In death he left it behind unassigned. The nation moved forward because it had to. It argued. It rebuilt unevenly. It protected some promises and delayed others. Some of what Lincoln hoped for would take shape. Much of it would be postponed. History would debate him endlessly. His caution, his limits, his compromises. But there was one thing history could not erase. When the moment came, when waiting became more dangerous than action, he did not turn away. He acted without certainty. He accepted consequence. That choice did not make him flawless. It made him human. And perhaps that is why his story does not end with applause or resolution. It ends with a question that still lingers in quiet moments. What happens when the person holding the weight is suddenly gone? Does the weight disappear, or does it settle slowly, unevenly on to everyone else? Lincoln had never claimed to save the nation alone. He had only tried to keep it from destroying itself in moments of anger. In the end, he could not stay to see whether the country learned that discipline. He left behind no final command, only a direction, only a reminder. That leadership is not certainty. It is responsibility carried without guarantee. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but the refusal to let conflict decide who you become, and that some decisions do not bring rest. They only make rest possible. The night closed in again. The war would end. The future would arrive uneven, contested, unfinished, and the weight Lincoln had carried would remain, not finished, but transferred to a nation still learning how to live with the consequences of its own freedom. The war did not end with a final word. It ended with a silence that no one had prepared for. On an evening meant for rest, for the small permission to stop holding everything, Abraham Lincoln sat among others in a place designed for forgetting. There was music, there was laughter. There was the rare feeling that nothing urgent was about to be asked of him. For the first time in years, the weight did not announce itself. And then, without warning, the weight lost its bearer. At first, no one understood what had happened. The sound arrived before meaning did. People moved before they knew why. When clarity came, it came as disbelief, not anger, not resolution, absence. Lincoln did not speak again. There was no final instruction, no last adjustment to what came next, no chance to guide the moment he had spent so long trying to shape. The nation woke the next morning as if something essential had been removed too quickly. The war was nearly over. Victory was close enough to feel real, and the man who had insisted on restraint at the edge of triumph was gone. Morning did not arrive as noise, it arrived as stillness. People gathered without knowing what to say. Bells rang without rhythm. Flags lowered slowly as if unsure how far grief was supposed to go. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. Unease. Because Lincoln had not only been a leader, he had been a holder. He had stood between anger and action, between victory and vengeance, between freedom declared and freedom carried carefully. And now that space was empty. In the days that followed, people searched his words, not for comfort, but for direction. They returned to the speeches, to the letters, to sentences that now felt heavier than when they were first spoken, with malice toward none. The words no longer sounded aspirational. They sounded unfinished. Lincoln had understood something that only becomes clear after loss, that the most dangerous moment is not when a conflict begins, but when it ends and asks who will carry what remains. The war would conclude, the armies would disperse, the noise would fade, but the weight would not. Questions lingered without answers. What does freedom require once it is no longer an idea? What does unity demand after it has been broken? What does restraint look like when anger feels justified? Lincoln had not answered these questions. He had only refused to let them be ignored. In life, he carried responsibility quietly. In death, he left it behind without instruction. And so the nation moved forward because it had no choice. It rebuilt unevenly. It argued. It protected some promises and postponed others. Some of what Lincoln hoped for would take shape. Much of it would wait. History would debate him endlessly. His caution, his compromises, his timing. But there was one truth that did not fade. When the moment came, when waiting became more dangerous than action, he did not turn away. He acted without certainty. He accepted consequence. That choice did not resolve everything. It transferred responsibility. The weight did not disappear when he did. It settled slowly, unevenly onto others, onto institutions, onto communities, onto people who would never meet him but would live with what he named. And perhaps that is where the story truly ends. Not with resolution, not with triumph, but with a quiet question left unanswered on purpose. When the person holding the weight is gone, does the weight vanish or does it become ours? The night closed again. The war would end. The future would arrive unfinished, uneven, demanding, and the responsibility Lincoln had carried would remain, not completed, but passed on.